It's a great book, no one reads it. That happens. So what do you do about that? It's like Nietzsche sold virtually nothing in his lifetime, right? And you know that's happened to lots of artists. So then it's a terrible book and everyone loves it. That happens too. And then it's a great book and everyone loves it. And then it's a terrible book and everyone hates it. That's probably a better category actually, that like it's a terrible book and everyone loves it. I mean, you wouldn't pick a terrible book that everyone hates if you had a choice. But at least the quality and the response match. At least it's truthful, like great book, good response. But the problem with those four categories is you can't really tell which category your production falls into, right? Because how do you know? And you know, I think you should assume horrible book, bad response, because that's the most likely, of all four of those categories, that's the one that's most likely to be true. But just, you know, purely on actuarial grounds, let's say. So, all right, so anyways, the cricket wanders away because he obviously, not only was he late for work that day, but he turned out to be wrong about everything. So he lets Pinocchio go off on his adventure, and Stromboli puts him in this little kind of like a touring wagon, you know, and away they go. And the cricket thinks, well, the conscience isn't needed anymore on this journey towards unearned celebrity. Well, meanwhile, back at the ranch, as they say, the puppet is supposed to come home after school. But he doesn't. He doesn't show up. And the kitten and the fish and Geppetto are all waiting there for him, ready to eat. Excuse me. But he doesn't show up. And so Geppetto goes out into the rain to look for him, and he can't find him. And then we see the inside of the traveling show cart, and Stromboli is having a snack and counting all the money that he's made from tonight's performance and hypothetically dividing it up with the puppet. So he's got this little stack of gold, and some of it's false, so somebody paid with looks like a little washer, like a mechanical washer, and it's bent. And so he curses about that for a while, even though it's interesting, because he's made all this money, it's been really successful, but this one little error is enough to enrage him, which is very ungrateful and tyrannical. It's like, look, you got 100 gold pieces, someone slipped you a fake one. It's like, you could have had 101. It's still a pretty good day, all things considered. You know, you got to make a bit of allowance for error, which is something a tyrant does not do. So, and that's perfect, because if you don't make allowance for error at all, then people are always guilty of something. And if you're a tyrant, that's exactly what you want. And people are always guilty of something. So the tyrant who's willing to exploit that is always on solid ground. So anyways, he doesn't share with Pinocchio, and he puts him in a birdcage, a jail. And then he also shows him this other puppet that has an axe through him that was the previous puppet who didn't precisely perform as he was supposed to. And so there's a big threat there. It's like, you stay in that jail, you do exactly what I want, or it's off to the woodpile for you to be burned. And so, well, that's just worth thinking about, because that's kind of what happens with tyrants. And so, and literally, not just metaphorically. So the cricket is basically wondering what in the world he should do, and then the cart rolls by and he gets an inkling, or hears, and I don't quite remember this, that Pinocchio is in there and might be in trouble, or he thinks that up. I'm sorry, I can't remember that, but he ends up inside the cart. He finds the traveling cart and he goes inside, and then he tries to pick the lock, because he's a bug, he can climb inside. He tries to pick the lock, he tries to get Pinocchio out of the jail that he's sort of collaborated himself into, you know. And it's interesting, because if you read, for example, if you read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which I would highly recommend, one of the things you find is that if you were arrested by the KGB, by the secret police in the Soviet Union, and you were hauled off to like a tribunal, before a judge, they wanted you to admit that you were guilty. You had to. Like, they torture you until you confessed. Or you could just confess. And that, I always found that so mysterious. It's like they kick down your door. They know perfectly well that they haven't got any more on you than they've got on anyone else. And yet, you have to go through the damn trial and you have to admit that they're right. It's like, why do they even bother with that? Why don't they just throw your sorry ass into the camp, which is essentially what's going to happen anyways? Why do they need your collaboration? You know, I've never quite figured that out. I think it's partly because they're not willing to let you stand in opposition to the rules, because the mere fact that you'll do that means that you exist as something that is allowed to exist outside the rules, and they're not having any of that. So that's part of it. But there's more to it. There's more to it than that. It's like the drama of collaboration. So one of the things I learned about societies like the Soviet Union, and this is true of all tyrannical societies, is that the idea that that's top down and that people are just following orders, they're good people but they're just following orders, it's like, you can forget about that. That's a stupid theory. When a society becomes tyrannical like that, the tyranny exists at every single level of the society. You tyrannize your own conscience. So let's say you're a true believer. You're a true believer in Marxist utopia, let's say, or National Socialist Third Reich that's going to last 1,000 years and be racially pure. You really believe that. And that's supposed to be a perfect state. And that's already been delivered to you. And so what that means is that insofar as you're a true believer, your own suffering becomes heretical. Because to the degree that you're suffering, you're living proof of the fact that the system is not delivering what it promised to deliver. And so you have to suppress that. You have to become your own tyrant. You can't admit that anything's gone wrong. And of course, you can't talk about it to your family, because 1 out of 3 of them are government informers, just like 1 out of 3 of everyone. And you're certainly not going to mention it in the workplace, because unless you're a devout Communist Party member, you're not going anywhere. And if any of your ancestors were like landowners or bourgeoisie, it's like, you're done. You're done. Class guilt, man. You're not going anywhere. And then every single level of the bureaucracy is exactly the same as that. And on the top, there's a tyrant. But the tyrant is everywhere. Everywhere. From the peak to the soul. It's all tyranny. And everyone participates in that by lying about everything. And that's why you see what happens next in the movie. So Pinocchio's in jail. And he's there because he was naive and he allowed himself to be enticed, and because he did something that would have run contrary to his conscience. But the movie doesn't put up straw men. You know, the poor damn puppet got tangled into this. His conscience wasn't even around. So you have to have some sympathy for him, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because he ends up in jail and he can't get out. And the fact that it in some ways wasn't his fault doesn't change the fact that he's in jail and he can't get out. And then I was watching Louis C.K. the other night, and he was talking about children lying. He was talking about his 9-year-old daughter lying, and he said, well, it's no wonder your children lie, and it's no wonder it's impossible for you to stop them, because, you know, you're talking to someone his head would scrape the roof. They weigh like 3 times as much as you, and they're capable of force, and they're intimidating. And they say to you something like, did you take that last cookie after I told you not to? And you're thinking, oh no, I took the cookie. What am I going to do? And then you get a genius idea in your head, which smarter children learn to lie earlier. Children with high IQs learn to lie younger. And CK says, well, it's like you've just been handed a magic get out of jail free card. You can just say, no, I didn't take that cookie. And worse than that, it works in every single situation if you get away with it. And now you're supposed to learn not to do that. I said, well, great. That's the thing about comedians, you know, they'll tell you the underlying truth, which is why people think they're so funny, like the jester in a king's court, right? He's the only one who's allowed to tell the king the truth because he's beneath contempt. That's what comedians do. And so, well, so what happens is, well, Pinocchio's not very happy about this, right? It's really breaking him up. And the blue fairy appears again from the star, same way. So what this means is, and I think this is right, this is something Jung talked about, and it was also extraordinarily brilliant. He said that it's one thing to break a rule when you don't really know the rule. You can, for whatever reason, you seem to get a bit of a free pass for that. But if then you know the rule, and then you break it anyways, you get hit a lot harder. And I know that's true, and I even think I figured out why it was true at one point, but I can't remember at the moment. But there's something about, it's like the severity of a moral error isn't quite as massive if you're genuinely ignorant and unconscious about the rule. And maybe it's because you're not violating your own belief system as much when you engage in the misactivity. It's something like that. So anyways, Pinocchio's in there, and he's partly at fault, at least because he's naive, and he's very desperate about it. But it's also because his conscience isn't functioning very well. So he has his reasons, and so whatever, the blue fairy shows up again. Mother Nature steps in to aid him. And so, and that is true, I would say, because it's not like you get walloped or killed every time you make a mistake, right? It's kind of interesting. And especially that's the case with kids, is like we have more leeway for them. Whether nature does, that's a different issue, but I would say yes, because you know, kids are really cute and they're appealing. And so, and they're naive and they're kind of helpless. They have those motions even that indicate helplessness, and that's associated with the natural apprehension of cuteness, right? So cuteness is big eyes, small nose, symmetrical features, baby-like features, helpless movements. That elicits sympathy and compassion, and it does it cross species, and so does the cry. And my roommate when I was in college had a niece who was quite young, about a year and a half old, I think, and we had a cat, wild cat, and it was a really fighty cat, partly because of me, because I would always play with it, and I let it fight with me quite a lot. So it was a fighty cat, and that little girl would come over, and you know, maybe she'd cry. That cat was like there right now trying to figure out what was wrong, and like the cat would use its claws on me, but it would never use its claws on the little kid, you know. And I thought, well, that's indication of that cross-species cuteness, you know, and you're all attracted to that more or less, and the more maternal you are, the more you're attracted to such things. But you know, you see something on YouTube and you go, ah, and that's like, that's so cute. It's like, yeah, it is. It appeals to exactly this. It appeals to this concomitation of infantile features, and it brings out compassion, unless you're psychopathic. So it's a good thing, but you know, it can be manipulated, that's for sure. Women actually manipulate it with makeup, which is quite sneaky and good of them. So anyways, so the blue fairy shows up, so that's nature. So what I'm saying is that nature will cut kids a break. If you think of nature in the guise of, well, their mother, for example, but even the biology of other people. Because we're wired to accept behavior from children that we wouldn't accept from other people. So nature will forgive. So she shows up in her heavenly guise and says, what's going on? And Pinocchio, again because he's naive, but also because he's not good. He's not evil either. He's neither or both. It depends on how you look at it. And he also has no idea how smart he is and how smart he isn't, or how smart the person he's talking to is. And instead of admitting what he's done, he lies about it. And that's interesting, because it does suggest that he understands at some level that he set himself up for this. Because, you know, he could just say, he could have just told the truth. This horrible fox kidnapped me and sold me to this slaveholder, which is true. It's a lot more true than the story he tells. He tells a story about some monster, you know, a fictional monster. He could have told even 3/4 of the truth and had it work, but he doesn't. He just obscures the story entirely. And this is the part of the movie that people remember. And I'd edited this out for years when I was talking about this movie. I forgot why it was so significant. His nose grows, right? And it grows to ridiculous length. And why is that? I think it was Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, I think, who said, One of the advantages to telling the truth is that you don't have to remember what you said. And that, God, that's worth listening to, because